Dogs were the first animals ever domesticated. They predate cattle, sheep, horses, and every crop we've ever grown. And yet, one of the most basic questions about them remains unanswered. Where did they actually come from? Well, a new study published in Nature brings us closer to an answer by decoding the ancient DNA of dogs and wolves that lived up to 14,000 years ago across Europe. Europe holds some of the oldest dog remains ever found, from sites like Kesslerloch in Switzerland, Bonn-Oberkassel in Germany, and Le Morhan in France, all dating back to roughly 40,000 to 17,000 years ago. However, knowing a bone is old doesn't really tell you whether the animal was actually a dog or just a wolf that happened to be small. Morphology can mislead, and previous genetic studies have been limited to mitochondrial DNA, which doesn't always reliably distinguish dogs from wolves. What scientists needed was nuclear DNA, so the full genome. But the problem is that ancient bones from cold and damp European caves preserve DNA quite terribly. In this study's pre-Neolithic samples, 95% of the remains contained less than 5% of their own DNA. So they needed a method to overcome this. They developed a molecular enrichment technique targeting nearly 500,000 specific genetic positions, boosting usable ancient DNA by 10 to 100 times. That was enough to classify 141 of the 216 specimens as either dog or wolf. Remarkably, only about 500 genetic variants were sufficient to make that call reliably. And there is one specimen standing above all others. We're talking about a 40,200-year-old canid from Kesslerloch in Switzerland, now confirmed as the oldest dog ever verified by nuclear ancient DNA. The test measured how much genetic drift it shares with a modern dog, in this case the African Basenji, and the result was quite clear. This animal belonged to the domestic dog lineage and not some separate European wolf population. Now, this directly refutes a long-standing idea that Paleolithic European dogs arose from an independent domestication event which would have been unrelated to Asian dogs. The Kesslerloch genome shows clear shared ancestry with dogs worldwide. But the early European dogs appear to derive almost entirely from an Eastern Eurasian wolf source, placing them genetically closer to Siberian and East Asian dogs than to ancient Middle Eastern dogs. An early Neolithic dog from Bonchuklu in Anatolia shows similar profile, suggesting that Western wolf ancestry now present in Near Eastern dogs would have arrived in that region only after around 11,400 years ago. One more interesting fact is that dogs today carry only about two-thirds of the genetic variation you would find in late glacial wolves. So there has been this long debate whether the loss happened during domestication or in later population bottlenecks, and the answer is now quite clear that reduced diversity was already present in the 14,200-year-old Kesslerloch dog and, in fact, all the other Mesolithic European dogs that were tested. The bottleneck, in other words, happened when dogs were first domesticated, as a small founding group of wolves became the ancestors of an entirely new lineage. So, what the Kesslerloch dog shows is something subtle about early dog history. Modern dog diversity follows an east to west gradient, with European dogs sitting somewhere in the middle. But Kesslerloch falls off the spectrum entirely, displaying unexpectedly low affinity to both extremes, in the sense that there are Native American dogs genetically closer to the 8,000-year-old Mesolithic Scandinavian dogs than to Kesslerloch. So this means dog population structure is at least 14,200 years old, and additional ancestry likely entered Europe between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, mixing with Kesslerloch-like dogs to produce the ancestral profile we see in later Mesolithic Europeans. However, dogs from Southwest Asia and Africa do show elevated affinity to the specimen, though whether ancestry flowed from Europe to the Near East or vice versa remains unresolved. And there is also something to learn about human history from this study. Around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, Southwestern Asian farming communities migrated into Europe in large numbers, replacing about 70% of hunter-gatherer human ancestry in the process. Dogs, on the other hand, tell a very different story. Southwestern Asian dog ancestry did enter Europe during the Neolithic, ranging from about 20% in Scottish dogs to 60% in a Greek subspecimen, but Mesolithic dog ancestry proved far more persistent than its human counterpart. Most Danish dogs from this period show no detectable Southwest Asian ancestry at all. The pitted ware culture dogs of Sweden also retained entirely Mesolithic ancestry. Modern European dogs still trace roughly half of their ancestry to pre agricultural Europe. So, this shows us that incoming farmers, it seems, didn't replace the dogs they found, but they adopted them. What research cannot yet pinpoint is when or where domestication occurred. That event almost certainly predates the Kesslerloch specimen by several thousand years. However, it does establish something quite remarkable if you think of it, which is that, the dog sleeping at the foot of your bed, it carries genes tracing back in an unbroken line to an animal that once sat beside a campfire in Paleolithic Switzerland more than 40,000 years ago. So that was long before wheat was planted and long before the first city was built. Well, hope you found this interesting. There is a link to the full study in the description. And if you do enjoy such content, hit subscribe for more ancient and medieval news. And of course, all things Vikings, that remains the main profile of this history project. This was Elena. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.